Erev Tov, good evening. My name is Yoram Meital. I'm a professor at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and chairperson of the Chaim Herzog Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Diplomacy. And I'm very honored to host the 2018 ceremony for the Robert St. John Chair for Objective Middle East Reporting. It is indeed a special privilege to hold this year the ceremony here and to be able to honor the memory of the legendary reporter Robert St. John. Today we celebrate both Robert and his wife Ruth for their remarkable generosity and support for Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. We are truly grateful for their commitment to Ben-Gurion University and above all for their Robert St. John's long fascination with the region of the Middle East and Israel in particular for many, many years. From the moment of its inception and birth throughout its many trials, Robert St. John demonstrated his passion for the events of this volatile region of the Middle East. We were extremely happy that the family decided to establish this prize to name St. John, to commemorate St. John legacy and work. In the scroll of the St. John Fund, the university wrote the following. The St. John Chair encouraged journalists from around the globe to present an insightful picture of the developments taking place in the Middle East, to further enhance knowledge and understanding of the events unfolding in the region. Having this in mind, every year that we celebrate this event, we're going through names of institutions, individuals who might fit into this vision of St. John. And the competition is quite hard every year. There are many, many journalists working in Israel. It will not be a surprise for you, as with all this history and conflicts and tensions, everything here in Israel and the Middle East, bringing in this attention by the international media. And as it happened this year also, we have looked into a dozen of, I would say, candidates that can fit into this high standard that the St. John Prize put and actually lead us, and we ended with Mr. Josef Joe Federman, and I'm welcoming here Joe. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce you and then to invite you to give your talk. So Mr. Featherman is a senior editor and writer at the Associated Press, the AP, supervising news coverage of Israel and the Palestinian territories. Over the two decades. He's working here. He has covered politics and policy, wars, business, culture, a lot of writing online and in print. He's engaged before working with AP with the Wall Street Journal. So we're talking here about many years of experience of writing on the Middle East, especially from Israel. In addition to his work for the AP office as the head of the office, Joe is also the bureau chief of the International Foreign Press Association in Israel. So a lot of work to be done in these two capacity. Joe was born and raised in Boston, and he holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and a certificate on Middle East studies. I think it's from Clark University. I'm very pleased to welcome you, and I'm looking forward to your presentation, and hopefully it will touch some of the issues that we in the committee had in mind when we considered your portfolio. Looking into the coverage of Middle East was, and I think still is, a huge challenge for foreign journalists. But the question is why it is so difficult for foreign journalists, why it is so difficult for them to get this heavy load of covering Israel and the Middle East in general. What are the specific challenges that journalists who write about the Middle East face in translating the reality here in this country and in other countries in the Middle East? How do journalists respond to these challenges, and or maybe how should they respond to these challenges? These are all very heavy questions we had in mind, and I'm honored and looking forward to your presentation. So join me in welcoming Joe Featherman to the podium.
Thank you, everyone, for having me here today and giving me this recognition. It's a huge honor. It's something I never expected. I'm used to people throwing tomatoes at me and complaining about what I do, so it's nice. They've assured me that this is a friendly audience, so I'm gonna take you up on that. But thank you to the Board of Governors of this prestigious university. Thank you to Professor Meital, who I've enjoyed getting to know since he informed me of this honor. Apparently, we also share the same tailor with the color combination there. So I wanted to thank, I don't know if there are any members of the St. John family. I wanted to thank the St. John family. I'll have more to say about that afterwards. Thank you to the Associated Press for giving me so many opportunities that I never, ever could have imagined when I got into this business. And of course, thank you to my beautiful wife, Carmit, who's here in the audience, who's now embarrassed and also deserves a prize just for putting up with me in general. So there you go. When I arrived in Israel with the AP in 2003, I had no idea what I was getting into. I had just left the Wall Street Journal in New York, where my colleagues treated my departure with a mixture of awe and friendly jealousy. To them, this was the assignment of a lifetime. In my hometown back in Massachusetts, Westboro, Massachusetts, I don't know if we have any Massachusetts people here, but my friends, and especially my parents' friends, they treated me like a hero. My first boss at the AP, Pete Matisse, he gave me a pep talk and told me that I was going on the adventure of a lifetime. Go slay your dragons. That was his exact quote to me. Go slay your dragons. My arrival in Israel, however, was something a little bit different. I remember being invited to a party shortly after getting here. These were not officials or military people or high society types that typically sponsor gatherings for journalists. This was just a party of middle-class professionals. One woman was a teacher, another person worked in marketing, one guy was a manager at a car rental company, and as I shook hands and made small talk, a guy who worked in finance came up to me and he says, "So, you're a foreign journalist?" And I said, "Yeah," and he kind of looked me up and down, and then he said, "Are you one of the ones who write good things or bad things?" And that was probably the best introduction that I could ever hope for. Back home, I was perceived as a blend of James Bond and Jimmy Buffett, leading this charmed life of intrigue and cocktails with little umbrellas in them, and no, that lifestyle does not really exist. At least I haven't found it yet. But here, I was viewed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Are you with us or against us? And it's been that way ever since. It's often said that we are reporting on a war of narratives. That may be putting it mildly. When it comes to Israelis and Palestinians, we're talking about cats and dogs, day and night, black and white. Now, in reality, it's a world filled with shades of gray. It's too bad that title was already taken, because that would be my memoir. But people with a stake in this conflict, and there are many, don't want to hear about that. And my job is to somehow make sense of this supercharged world. And if I can't do that, there are plenty of people willing to help me. Both sides offer a never-ending flow of briefings and experts trying to shape my opinions. I receive dozens, sometimes hundreds of emails each day from government ministries and PR agencies. There are nonprofit advocacy groups who lobby for coverage tilted in one way or another. There are even people and organizations who devote their days to monitoring media coverage and letting you know when they think you've got it wrong, oftentimes by trying to pressure or even shame you on social media. We see this war of narratives on display not too far from here, along the Gaza border. Each Friday over the past month or so, we see thousands of Palestinians gathering along the border to shout and throw rocks and burn tires and fly flaming kites into Israel. Israeli snipers, in turn, frequently open fire. Hundreds of people have been wounded. Several dozen have been killed. To the Palestinians, this is nonviolent protest, standing up to a brutal Israeli blockade and upholding the rights of refugees to return to their families' long-lost lands. To the Israelis, they're defending a sovereign border against a vicious plot to infiltrate the country and attack Israeli civilians. While the Palestinians and many in the international community accuse Israel of shooting unarmed civilians, Israel accuses Hamas of manipulating those civilians and putting them in harm's way and even hiding among them. Of course, there are elements of truth to both sides. As I like to put it when I sum up this conflict, everyone is right and everyone is wrong. Those shades of gray that I mentioned have been lost, and if you explain the thinking of one side, you often face accusations of bias, and risk retribution from the other. Just last week, I hosted an event with Michael Oren, the former ambassador to Washington, who said that many of his colleagues have become so despondent that they don't even think it's worth speaking to the international media anymore. They feel they can't even get a fair shake. Now, the public relations aspect of this conflict is just one of the challenges we face as journalists. There's also the business side. As I'm sure that you've all heard by now, the state of modern journalism is one of very limited resources. The big budgets we once had are no longer there. Staff sizes are not what they once were. We are forced to do more with less. Furthermore, the advent of social media has shaken up the journalism world in ways that we never could have imagined. Facebook, Google, and others have gobbled up the advertising market that once was the lifeblood of community newspapers. These companies, while providing many positive things to the world, are now the main conduits for the world's flow of information. They distribute news from the AP and others, controlling vast chunks of the global advertising business while giving very little back to the original publishers in return. Imagine a world where you work 12 hours a day to produce something that's given away for free. It's not a great business model. Yet this, in many ways, is what has happened to journalism. Social media and the internet have shaken up the news world in other ways. They've removed many of the barriers to entry for other news sources. Anyone with a smartphone can be a journalist. Anyone with a Twitter account can be his or her own news agency. Now, while I believe that the flow of information and ideas is generally a good thing, it has also opened the door to abuses. We now live in a world in which our news feeds are flooded with a never-ending flow of reports shaped by algorithms, essentially determining what we want to read or what it thinks we want to read. Where newspapers were once the place where the reader could flip pages and learn about new places and stumble upon new ideas, news feeds have created the so-called echo chambers of similar reports that tend to reinforce our opinions and too often deepen our divisions. Many of these reports come from dubious sources, fake news in the truest sense of the term. I'm not talking about reports that President Trump doesn't like. We're talking about stories concocted by Russian bots or white supremacists or young entrepreneurs trying to generate clicks on their sites to drum up advertising. This news is truly fake, yet it often impacts public discourse. And it doesn't end there. Politicians use social media to get around us or even to attack us. We've all seen how President Trump uses Twitter to go after his critics in the media in deeply personal and vindictive ways. Israel's own prime minister here makes no secret of his preference for the controlled environment of social media. Why face questions from those pesky reporters when you can simply put out a pre-recorded statement straight to the public on Facebook or Twitter? Too often, this passes as public discourse. Democracy suffers. Social media has also brought out some bad habits in the traditional media. It's created an environment where people want to be the first and the fastest to break a story, to offer the wittiest and snarkiest commentary, to generate clicks and likes and followers. And in our quest to be liked, and I want to be liked, we all want to be liked, and to build our personal brands, I've seen too many people go too far. They're forced to apologize. I've seen people lose their jobs after posting things that are offensive or inaccurate. So now, that maybe I've depressed a few people in here, I want to tell you why I'm actually optimistic. Why in many ways we're in a golden age of journalism. You see, journalists are a stubborn and hardworking bunch. You can ask Harmeet. A stiff-necked people, as we might say in this part of the world, and we're not ready to roll over. In a world of information overload, people are looking for sources they can trust. And that's what sets apart places like the AP and other traditional media sources. The AP, and I'm going to focus on that because that's what I know best, but the AP has an unmatched global footprint with bureaus in virtually every country on the planet. We even have a bureau in North Korea, believe it or not. And most important, we have standards, extremely high standards. That means that information must be reliable. We check and double check our sources of information, and we tightly restrict our use of anonymous sources. We consult and collaborate and have intense internal debates. I like to tell my own staff that as important as it is to break a story, I would rather be right than first. If something doesn't feel right, make another call, speak to another source before running with it. Like other large organizations, we have people who work on fact checks, looking at the veracity of claims by politicians. And it's no accident that these fact checks and those at other news organizations are extremely popular with readers. People appreciate information they can rely on. So while we face obstacles like never before, today's generation of journalists is also reporting some of the best stories of our times. Look at the impact that places like the New York Times and the New Yorker had this past year by breaking the story of producer Harvey Weinstein and spawning the global Me Too movement. Other Pulitzer Prize winners this year broke stories about Russian interference in the presidential election and the American opioid crisis. My colleagues at the AP were recognized, they were finalists for the Pulitzer, for a series that showed the devastation wrought upon the northern Iraqi city of Mosul in the US defeat of Islamic State fighters. Just a week ago, my own staff produced an expose on Israel's stifling permit system, which controls virtually every aspect of Palestinian movement in and out of the West Bank and Gaza. Now, this lecture today is meant to recognize objective journalism, and I often find myself asking if it's even possible to be objective, especially in this part of the world. We're all certainly biased. Now, not in the way you think. I do not wake up thinking how I'm going to make Israel look good or bad in the media. But every journalist is a product of his or her own upbringing and life experiences. I grew up in American suburbia, just outside of Boston. I played Little League, and I went to college in the US. I've worked with people who were the children of Holocaust survivors, who served in the Israeli military, whose families are Palestinian refugees, who live in blockaded Gaza. We all have vastly different backgrounds that shape our outlooks. Over 15 years here, I've been here since 2003, my own views have continued to evolve. Every day, I learn something new. I've covered 4 Israeli elections and 4 wars. I had to scramble for cover during a Hezbollah missile attack when I was in Haifa, covering the Second Lebanon War up north. In the worst day of my professional life, 2 members of my staff were killed in an explosion in Gaza during the 2014 war, while a third was badly wounded and will remain disabled for the rest of his life. Now, in addition to my day job at the AP, as he mentioned, I am the chairman of the Foreign Press Association. This is a volunteer position. I represent roughly 400 journalists working for international media organizations as they deal with bureaucracy and security challenges in 3 very different areas: Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Each of these areas presents its own complex set of challenges, and each has its own way of trying to pressure us. Sometimes there's verbal intimidation, sometimes it's physical. I'm now leading a case in the Israeli Supreme Court against the Israeli police force over safety and access issues after journalists were roughed up and blocked last summer from covering unrest in Jerusalem's Old City. I've led a campaign against the Israeli practice of strip searching journalists, usually Arab journalists, including Israeli citizens, when they enter government buildings. You can often hear me on Israeli radio complaining about this practice. This is an area of expertise I assure you I never expected to gain when I got into this business. But I am now the strip search guy, if you have any questions afterwards. In Gaza, I've seen our relations with Hamas go through various ups and downs over the years and had some uncomfortable conversations with them over their treatment of journalists. Just last year, I had to speak to Hamas after they arrested a correspondent at gunpoint for covering a public demonstration. Once again, I found myself trekking to Gaza, and not for the first time, to complain about something that seemed so obviously wrong. At the same time, Hamas is acutely aware of its image and has generally welcomed the international media and invited us to come to Gaza and show the world how bad conditions have become there. So in this interesting and dynamic working environment, it is difficult, I think, to remain unbiased. Every experience, every person you meet makes a small impression. But this does not mean one cannot be objective. In fact, I think that bias and objectivity can complement one another. One of the greatest tragedies I've witnessed in my time here is just how far apart the 2 sides have grown. As a result of the Second Intifada, Israel has done a tremendous job of insulating itself from the conflict. It's built a West Bank barrier and perfected its use of intelligence and military force to keep things relatively quiet. Most of the time, it's very quiet here. The result is that the country has a standard of living on par with Western Europe. It has world-class universities, and we're at one of them, a thriving high-tech scene, and a food and culture that put most other countries I've been to shame. But all of this has come at a price. By closing themselves behind these walls, most Israelis have little to no contact with Palestinians. In Jerusalem, where I live, where 1/3 of the city is Palestinian, I think it's safe to say that most Jewish Israelis have little knowledge of what's going on in Arab neighborhoods, not to mention parts of the West Bank, just a 10 or 15-minute car ride away. A similar phenomenon has happened on the Palestinian side. Contact with Israelis is minimal. In the best cases, West Bank Palestinians may be allowed to work in Israel or a nearby settlement, where perhaps they get to know their Israeli supervisor. In other cases, their contacts with Israelis are limited to soldiers at a checkpoint or at the military liaison office, where they have to wait in line for work permits and travel permits. Many simply have no contact with Israelis. Friendships are extremely rare. A movement against normalization with Israelis is growing, especially among younger Palestinians in their 20s who refuse to have any contact with Israelis. Now, I'm not here to cast blame. We could debate who's responsible all day, and there's plenty of blame to go around. But the end result is deeply disturbing. People, good people, living alongside one another who have little to no contact, resulting in stereotypes and demonization. This cannot possibly be good for the future. And that is where we as journalists come into play. The news industry is one of the few professions where Israelis, Palestinians, and foreigners all work together as colleagues, committed, hopefully, to that same goal. I've always felt that the job of a journalist is not to tell people what to think. It is to tell them what to think about. The dozens of journalists covering this place may not agree on everything, but the combination of world-class journalistic standards, along with the insights a diverse staff can bring, hopefully provide a rich picture of what's going on here from all sides. I'm often asked, what's the best story? What's my favorite story that I've ever written? And honestly, I don't know. Part of it is because I can't seem to remember beyond about 48 hours ago, but I've done so many stories. I've flown in helicopters, I've been to dusty military bases, I joined Prime Minister Ariel Sharon on a trip to Washington, I've covered wars and peace conferences, elections, I've met my fair share of celebrities, but the stories that stick with me are the ones about individuals. About 7 years ago, I took a ride to the town of Yokneam, up north, to write about a new program used to teach Arabic to Jewish Israeli school children. It turns out that for decades, in a country with a sizable Arab population, most Israeli children learned Arabic from Jewish teachers. I went to observe a program in which an Arab teacher was teaching Jewish kids her mother tongue. The scene was heartwarming. A young teacher named Maram Afur invited me into her classroom, and the kids absolutely adored her. Not only was she teaching the kids how to speak Arabic, she was teaching them about Arab culture, about Arab family life, about her children, about humanity. In her own way, she was breaking down all of those barriers that I spoke about earlier. Those are my favorite types of stories. Taking something small, like a classroom in a small town, and telling the world something bigger about modern Israel. That's what journalism is. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes, seeing things through their eyes, and hopefully enlightening the world just a little bit more about this amazing, infuriating, gut-wrenching, tragic, and uplifting place. These are the types of stories you will never find on politicians' YouTube sites. And this is why I ask every one of you to encourage and support and seek out good, objective, and independent journalism. Thank you. I wanted to add one other thing, and then if people have questions, if there's time, I'm happy to take questions. This award is named after Robert St. John. I don't know how much you know about Robert St. John. I was not familiar with him until I heard about this prize, and I did some research, and it turns out that he was a very accomplished AP correspondent. During World War II, he worked for the same company early in his career before he went on to do many other impressive things. This was why, one of the reasons I was so excited to get this recognition, and why the AP literally jumped. They were so excited when they heard about this. What I did to prepare for this speech, I had the AP archives, the librarian, send me a collection of records about St. John and some of the articles he wrote during World War II. It turns out that St. John reported on fighting in Romania, massacres of Jews and bitter anti-Semitism there, and then of German collaborators hidden among refugees in Greece, where he was shot in the leg during the Blitzkrieg. He ultimately left the AP, and I'm going to end this with a quote, to join NBC Radio, which was a huge deal. This was in the 40s. I am and always have been and always will be loyal to the AP. However, with my own country on the verge of war, I feel I have a duty. There are certain useful functions I can perform on the basis of what I've been through. I feel almost in a crusading spirit in my desire to talk about the realities of the situation. So I came with a few gifts. I don't know if there's anybody here from the family, but I went through the AP archive, and I hope everybody will appreciate. I found a picture of St. John with Ben-Gurion. So apparently, I think he wrote, I can't remember, I think it was 23 books, but they included a biography of David Ben-Gurion. So here's a picture of him with Ben-Gurion and Paula, his wife. And I also printed out a couple of the originals. I don't know what you can do with this stuff. But it was really fascinating looking at these original reports. So I have the original cable. This tells you what type of guy St. John was. This was after he was shot. He sent a cable to New York headquarters. He says, "Doctor suggests return America immediately. Therefore, respectfully submit resignation. Planning, catch first available transportation." And then immediately the AP, you gotta love the AP, somebody named Mr. Price, he said, quote, "Unacceptable. Unacceptable resignation, sympathize deeply, thoroughly understand, gladly approve, return salary, continuing, and can we help you and Mrs. St. John?" I printed out, I won't read the whole thing, but a first-person account of what he went through in Greece. It's really amazing stuff. And then the AP, he was such an important figure. What did I do with it? I can't find it. Here it is. No, but somewhere I have one more. The AP actually wrote a story about him when he resigned because he was such a towering figure in journalism at the time. So I hope you can get these to the right people, and thank you everybody for having me.